Just before Bannack Cemetery closed, Edward caught two young lovers kissing among the graves. He asked them to leave. Instead, they smiled and offered him $2,000 to stay for one night. That was the biggest mistake of his life. Edward Morris was 45 years old and worked as the gravekeeper of Bannack Cemetery, Montana, for nearly 12 years. Every morning before the sun reached the mountains, he unlocked the old iron gate and walked slowly through hundreds of forgotten graves. He trimmed flowers, cleaned old headstones, and guided visitors who came from all over America to see one of the country's most famous ghost towns. Most people stayed for only a few hours, took pictures, shared ghost stories, and left before dark. Edward stayed after everyone was gone. That was his job. That was his life. His home stood inside the cemetery grounds. It was one of several old brick houses left from the mining days. Most had broken roofs and cracked walls, but one was still strong enough to live in. Edward lived with his wife Sarah and their 15-year-old son named Rice. The house was small, cold in winter, and always smelled faintly of old wood and damp stone. Still, Sarah tried to make it feel like a real home. Money was always a problem. Edward's paycheck barely covered food, heating, and school expenses. Rice was one of the smartest students in town and dreamed of studying engineering one day. Edward wanted to help him, but every time he looked at the bills on the kitchen table, that dream seemed farther away. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered if he would ever earn enough to give his son a better future. One cold October afternoon, the cemetery was busier than usual. Tourists wandered through the flower gardens, photographers captured the old buildings, and guides told stories about Bannack's haunted past. Edward noticed a young couple walking slowly near the oldest graves. The man looked about 26, the woman looked around 24. They laughed quietly, held hands, and couldn't seem to stop looking at each other. More than once he saw them disappear behind old stone walls, only to return smiling as if they had forgotten the rest of the world. He smiled to himself. Young love was nothing unusual. As the afternoon faded into evening, the visitors began leaving. Cars disappeared one by one until the cemetery became silent again. Edward locked the main gate, as he always did, then took one last walk through the grounds. That was when he saw the same couple again. They were standing beside the old flower garden near one of the abandoned brick houses. The woman leaned close and kissed the man softly. Edward called out politely, "Sorry, folks, the cemetery is closed." The couple looked toward him. The man smiled. "We'll leave in a minute." Edward nodded and continued walking. But when he looked back only a few seconds later, they were gone. Not walking away, not hiding behind a tree, simply gone. Edward frowned. The abandoned house beside the garden had no lights, no doors, and half of its roof had already collapsed years ago. There was nowhere they could have disappeared. For the first time that night, something about Bannack Cemetery didn't feel normal anymore. Edward hurried home through the freezing wind. The $2,000 felt heavy inside his coat pocket. He had never held that much cash at one time. Sarah looked up as he entered. "You're late." "I had to help some visitors." She noticed the smile on his face. "What happened?" Edward placed the money on the kitchen table. Sarah's eyes grew wide. "Edward, where did this come from?" "They rented the old brick house for one night." Sarah stepped back. "The broken house? The one everyone says is haunted?" Edward laughed. "Ghost stories don't pay bills." Sarah picked up the money and counted it twice. "It feels wrong." "It feels like a blessing," Edward replied. He didn't tell her everything. He didn't mention the strange couple. He didn't mention how they had appeared after the cemetery closed, or how they had vanished already. Outside, the snow began falling. The old cemetery became completely silent. Edward couldn't stop thinking about the couple. Something pulled him back outside. He told himself that it was only to check whether they were warm enough, nothing more. He grabbed 2 thick blankets and walked toward the abandoned house. A soft orange light flickered through a broken window. Edward stopped. There was no electricity inside that building. Slowly, he stepped closer. Through a narrow crack in the wall, he saw the couple sitting on the dusty floor. The young woman rested her head against the man's shoulder. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. She smiled. Not the smile of someone afraid, the smile of someone completely in love. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked into each other's eyes. The man whispered something Edward couldn't hear. The woman laughed softly. Then she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, tender, like 2 people trying to forget the rest of the world. Edward looked away. He suddenly felt guilty for watching. He knocked gently on the broken wall. "I brought blankets." The couple turned. The young woman stood first. "Thank you," she said warmly. Her hands were freezing as she accepted the blankets. The young man nodded with a grateful smile. "You've helped us more than you know." Edward forced a smile. "I hope tomorrow brings better luck." For just 1 second, the young man's expression changed, almost like he wanted to say something. Instead, he simply replied, "I don't think tomorrow will change anything." Edward frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman quickly interrupted. "We've been together a long time. We just wanted one peaceful night." Her answer sounded normal, but something about her voice made Edward's skin crawl. As he turned to leave, he heard them speaking again, very quietly, too quietly to understand. Then, the woman suddenly looked toward the broken doorway, straight at Edward, even though he was already outside. Their eyes met. She smiled, not with happiness, not with kindness. It looked like goodbye. Edward walked home faster than before. He couldn't explain why. Back inside, Sarah was asleep. Chi still studying. "Dad," Chi said, "did you know nobody has lived in that brick house for over 30 years? Edward looked up. "Who told you that?" "Our history teacher. He said 2 young people disappeared there a long time ago." Edward laughed. "Old stories." Chi shrugged.
Maybe. But he also said, no one ever found their bodies. Edward didn't answer. He slowly reached into his pocket and touched the roll of cash. For the first time, it felt ice cold.
Edward stood still for several seconds. His flashlight swept across the flower garden. Nothing. The young couple had disappeared without making a sound. He walked toward the old brick house anyway. The front door had fallen off years ago. Moonlight spilled through the broken roof, lighting up piles of bricks and rotten wood. The cold wind moved through the empty rooms. "Hello?" Edward called. No answer. He searched every corner. Nobody. He finally shook his head. "Kids," he whispered, "always finding places to hide." Back at home, Sarah had already prepared dinner. "You look tired," she said. Edward forced a smile. "Just another busy day." Rice looked up from his homework. "Dad, my science teacher said I should apply for the state engineering program." Edward smiled proudly. "That's great." "But," Rice hesitated, "the application fee is almost $500. The room became quiet. Edward looked down at his plate. $500. To some people, it was nothing. To him, it felt impossible. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. The wind pushed against the old windows, making the house creak every few minutes. Edward couldn't sleep. Around 11 o'clock, he grabbed his heavy coat, picked up his flashlight, and decided to check the cemetery one last time. He always did one final walk before bed. It helped him sleep. As he reached the flower garden, he froze. The same young couple was there again, standing in exactly the same place. The woman looked cold, rubbing her hands together. The man stepped toward Edward. "Sir," his voice was calm, "we need a place to stay tonight." Edward frowned. "The cemetery is closed." "We know. We'll pay." Edward stayed silent. The young man slowly pulled a thick roll of cash from his jacket. "I'll give you $2,000. Edward stared at the money. 2,000. It was more than he earned in several weeks. The man continued. "We only need one night. No questions. No visitors. Tomorrow morning, we'll be gone." Edward felt his heart beating faster. Rice's school, the bills, the broken heater. Everything rushed into his mind at once. He knew he should refuse, but he couldn't stop looking at the money. "There is one old house," Edward said. "It isn't safe. It has no heat. We don't care." Edward led them toward the abandoned brick house near the flower garden. Inside, dust covered everything. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. The woman smiled warmly. "This is perfect." The young man handed Edward the cash. Real cash, not fake. Edward slipped it into his pocket. "I'll bring you some blankets," he said. The woman thanked him softly. As Edward turned to leave, he noticed the couple standing very close together. They smiled at each other as if no one else existed. He quietly closed the broken door behind him and walked back through the dark cemetery. Something about them still didn't feel right. Not because they were hiding. Not because they had money. Because neither of them had asked where the nearest road was. Neither had asked for food. Neither had even looked afraid. It was as if they already knew this place, and they had come here for only one reason. Edward barely slept. Just before sunrise, a wan scream shattered the silence. He grabbed his flashlight and ran toward the abandoned brick house. The roof had collapsed, dust filled the air, broken bricks covered the floor. The couple was gone. Edward searched every room. Nothing. No footprints. No blood, no bags, no blankets. It was as if nobody had ever been there. Then he found the money. The same roll of cash lying beneath a broken brick. He picked it up, still cold, still perfectly dry. A sheriff's truck arrived minutes later. Someone from town had reported the collapse. Sheriff Collins looked around. "Anyone inside?" Edward hesitated. "I thought I was." "You thought?" Edward looked at the ruined house. "I saw a young man and a young woman last night." The sheriff searched the area with 2 deputies. Nothing. One deputy laughed. "Probably tourists." Another shook his head. "No tire tracks. No footprints. The snow never moved." Edward stared at the untouched snow. That was impossible. He had walked them here himself. The sheriff looked at Edward. "You've been working too much. Go home, get some rest." Edward didn't argue, but deep inside, he knew what he had seen. That afternoon, visitors filled the cemetery again. Edward forced himself to work. Near the flower garden, an elderly woman stopped beside him. She pointed toward the ruined house. "My parents warned me about that place." Edward looked at her. "Why?" She smiled sadly. "When I was a little girl, I saw a young couple kissing in that garden." Edward's heartbeat slowed. "How long ago?" The woman thought for a moment. "My father had just returned from Vietnam." Edward froze. "That was more than 50 years ago." "They were beautiful," she continued. The boy couldn't stop looking at the girl. They looked like they were deeply in love. Edward reached for his phone. He quietly opened the security photos he had taken yesterday. He showed her the picture. Her face lost all color.
With shaking hands, she pointed at the screen. It's them. The same couple. They haven't aged a single day. Before Edward could ask another question, the old woman hurried away. She never looked back. Edward looked down at the photo. The young woman was smiling. But now, he noticed something he had missed before. Behind the couple, inside the broken window, two pale faces that had not been there when he took the picture.
Edward couldn't stop staring at the photo. The young couple stood in the flower garden. Behind them, two pale faces watched through the broken window. He zoomed in. His hands began to shake. The faces looked exactly like the couple, but their eyes were empty. Their skin was gray, almost like dead people. Edward rushed back to the ruined house. The sheriff had already left. The yellow warning tape moved in the cold wind. Edward stepped over it. The floor had collapsed farther than before. As he shined his flashlight into the hole, he noticed something buried beneath the broken bricks. It wasn't a body. It was a silver necklace. He picked it up. A tiny heart-shaped locket hung from it. Inside was a faded photograph. The same young woman, smiling, standing beside the same young man. On the back, someone had carved 4 words: forever, even after death. Edward's breathing became heavier. Suddenly, a soft laugh echoed through the empty house. A woman's laugh. He turned. Nobody. Then another sound. A man's whisper. So close. Edward spun around again. The house was empty. His flashlight flickered. For 1 second, he saw the young couple standing at the end of the hallway, holding each other, looking into each other's eyes. The woman gently touched the man's face. He kissed his forehead. Then they both looked at Edward. Neither smiled. The young woman slowly raised one finger and pointed toward the floor. The light went out. Everything became black. Edward hit the flashlight with his hand. It came back on. The hallway was empty again. Only the necklace remained in his hand. Then he heard footsteps above him, slow, heavy. Someone was walking across the broken roof, but there was no roof left. Edward slowly looked up. Nothing. Only the night sky. As he backed toward the exit, his boot struck something hard. He looked down. A cracked stone had shifted. Under it, he saw the corner of an old wooden door hidden beneath the house. A cellar, one that had never appeared on any map. And from the darkness below, 2 voices whispered together. Edward, please, don't leave us here. Edward knelt beside the hidden wooden door. The whispers stopped. Only the wind moved through the broken house. He pulled away the loose bricks and grabbed the old iron handle. It wouldn't move. He pulled harder. With a loud crack, the door slowly opened. A wave of freezing air rushed upward. His flashlight revealed narrow stone steps leading into darkness. Edward hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave. Instead, he walked down. The cellar smelled of wet earth and old wood. Dust covered everything. No one had entered this place for decades. At the end of the tunnel stood a small room, a rusty metal bed, a broken lantern, 2 empty coffee cups, and fresh red roses. Edward stopped. Someone had placed them there recently. He touched one. The petals were still soft. Someone had been inside this cellar only hours ago. Then he noticed another object, a woman's scarf, the same deep red scarf the young woman had been wearing the night before. As he picked it up, a sweet perfume filled the room. The scent was fresh, as if she had just walked away. A quiet laugh echoed behind him. Edward turned quickly. The young woman stood at the entrance of the cellar. She looked exactly as she had the night before. Beautiful, calm. Her eyes never left his. She stepped closer, very slowly. "So," she whispered, "you came." Edward couldn't speak. She stopped only a few feet away. "You've been looking for us." She gently reached toward him. Her fingers brushed his hand. They felt cold, ice cold. She smiled. "You were kind to us. We never forgot." Before Edward could answer, the young man appeared beside her. He wrapped one arm around her waist. She leaned against him. The two looked completely in love. The man kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes and smiled. For a moment, they looked like any ordinary young couple sharing a private moment. Then the man's eyes opened. He stared directly at Edward. His smile disappeared. "You shouldn't have opened this room." Edward took one step backward. "What is this place?" Neither of them answered. Instead, they both looked toward the far wall. Edward slowly turned his flashlight. The beam stopped on dozens of names carved in the stone. Every name belonged to a missing visitor. The last name had been carved only yesterday. Edward Morris. His own name. A cold breath touched the back of his neck. He spun around. The couple had vanished. Only the red scarf remained on the ground. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the cellar, 2 skeletons began knocking from the other side of the wall. The knocking grew louder. 1, 2, 3 heavy knocks. Then silence. Edward pressed his ear against the cold stone wall. A faint whisper slipped through. "Help us." He searched the cellar until he found an old pickaxe buried beneath rotten wood. With shaking hands, he struck the wall. The first hit cracked the stone. The second broke away a large piece. The third opened a narrow hole. A terrible smell rushed out. Edward covered his nose and shined his flashlight inside. There was another room. Smaller. Hidden. He crawled through. The walls were covered with old newspaper pages from the 1970s. Every headline told the same story. Young couple missing. Search ends without answers. No bodies ever found. Edward's heartbeat pounded in his ears. At the center of the room stood a wooden chest. Its lock had already rusted away. He slowly lifted the lid. Inside, he found 2 wedding rings, a faded photograph, and a small leather diary. The last page was stained with dried mud. The final sentence read, "If nobody finds us, we'll never leave this room." Suddenly, the cellar became warm. The perfume returned. Edward looked up. The young couple stood only a few feet away. The woman stepped close to the man. She held both of his hands. Their eyes never left each other. She smiled through tears. "I told you, we'd never be apart." The man gently kissed her forehead again. Then he looked at Edward. "This place became our grave, but not our prison." He slowly pointed towards the loose dirt beneath the wooden chest. Edward dropped to his knees and started digging. The soil was soft. Only a few inches down, his shovel struck bone. He dug faster, then stopped. 2 human skeletons lay beneath the floor. Their arms were wrapped tightly around each other, exactly the way the couple had embraced every time Edward saw them. One skeleton still wore the silver necklace. The other still wore a wedding ring. Edward finally understood. The couple he had spoken to, the couple he had sheltered, the couple who smiled, kissed, and held each other every night, had been dead for decades. As tears filled his eyes, both skeletons slowly turned their skulls toward him. Their jaws opened together, and in one chilling whisper they spoke his name. "Edward." Then they said something that made every drop of blood leave his body. "You're not here to find us. You're here because someone is coming for your family." Edward stood frozen. The 2 skeletons slowly lifted their skulls. The whisper came one last time. "We never wanted your life. We only needed your hands." The cellar began shaking violently. Large stones crashed from the ceiling. Edward grabbed the diary, the necklace, and the photograph. He climbed the stairs as fast as he could. Behind him, the hidden room collapsed forever. By the time he reached the surface, the entrance had completely disappeared beneath broken bricks. No one would ever find it again without knowing exactly where to dig. Edward ran home through the freezing night. When he opened the front door, Sarah rushed toward him. She threw her arms around him. "Where were you? I was so worried." Rice was sitting at the kitchen table, still studying. Everything looked normal. Edward looked at them for a long moment. Then he quietly hugged them both. He realized something. For the first time in years, he cared more about them than money. The $2,000 were still inside his coat. He slowly removed the bundle of cash. Then he walked to the fireplace. Without saying a word, he threw it into the flames. Sarah looked shocked. "Edward, what are you doing?" Edward watched the money burn. "I don't want anything that belongs to the dead." The fire became brighter. Then every bill turned into dry autumn leaves. Within seconds, nothing remained. The next morning, Edward led Sheriff Collins to the exact spot beneath the ruined brick house. The excavation lasted all day.
Just before sunset, the workers uncovered two skeletons still holding each other, exactly as Edward had seen them. The silver necklace rested around the woman's neck. The wedding rings were still on their hands. Sheriff quietly removed his hat. They stayed together until the end. Forensic investigators later confirmed the identities. The couple had disappeared in the winter of 1974. No one had ever solved the case until now. A week later, the town buried them together beneath a single white headstone. Edward, Sarah, and Rice attended the funeral. Rice placed 2 white roses beside the grave. Sarah held Edward's hand. No one spoke. They didn't need to. As everyone walked away, a warm breeze crossed the cemetery. The roses gently moved, even though there was no wind anywhere else. Edward smiled. Perhaps some love stories never really end. Edward turned to leave. Then something caught his eye. The old security camera overlooking the flower garden blinked. Later that night, he watched the recording. The camera showed Edward walking through the garden, talking, smiling, opening the door of the ruined house. But there was one impossible detail. Edward was completely alone. No young man, no young woman, no kisses, no conversation, nothing. The camera never recorded them, only Edward. He slowly reached into his pocket. The silver necklace was still there. He looked toward the dark cemetery, and somewhere beyond the graves, a young woman whispered, "Thank you, Edward."